Hello, I'm Raman Chagger and I'm a principal consultant at the Building Research Establishment, and I'll be talking today about collaborative research work that we've done, which has been looking into how to reduce fire fatalities and serious injuries with the aim of coming up with solutions and ways to prevent those. So in terms of an introduction, the fire fatalities in the UK have come down significantly over the last 25 to 35 years. And this is largely due to a number of measures which have been taken, such as the increased use of smoke alarms, the furnishing regulations that came out in 1988, and home fire safety visits that have been taking place since around that time too, where fire and rescue services go home to people's homes to try and do a visit and see ways in which the fire risk can be reduced. So as you can see from the two graphs showing England and Scotland, those fatalities have come down significantly over that time. So the aim of this research work was really to look at the data that was available on fire fatalities and serious injuries to try and identify what more could potentially be done to further reduce these. So there was a number of different organisations that supported this research work: the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the Fire Industry Association, Scottish Government and the BRE Trust. And really, this group of collaborators got together to try and identify the best way in which this data could be used to try and identify solutions for the future. So the research program itself was conducted over two phases. So there was a first phase, which was looking at the overall data that was gathered by fire and rescue services from their incident recording system, which they fill out during every fire event that they attend. And really over a 4-year period, we looked at over 19,645 incidents, looking at the data in dwellings to try and identify the fatalities and the serious injuries. What were the conditions under which those happened? And that was phase one. And just for clarification, the serious injuries, how it's classified within the IRS, which is question 9.24, and it's code 1. So those were the ones that we were looking at. So that was kind of like a top level look at what is happening and what can be done to reduce those. And then phase two was really looking at a lot more detail at the fire investigation reports resulting from those fire fatalities. So looking at each one individually. And fire investigation reports can be anything between 4 and 20 pages, and it details in a lot more with a lot more information what exactly happened and the follow-up investigations that were done. So I'll talk about phase one first. So really the group got together and there were a number of different questions they wanted answering. So all of those questions were proposed. So we knew exactly what we were trying to aim with this project. And then they were broken down between some questions that could be answered in phase one and some questions that would be approached in phase two. So for phase one, 38 key questions were posed really. And these were looking at the data from IRS to try and identify what types of properties are fatal fires occurring in. What are the details around the fire discovery? Was there a fire alarm system present? What was the cause of the fire? What ignition sources are typically causing these? Were impairments a factor in resulting in an injury or a fatality? What was the movement of the victim during the fire? What did they do? And ultimately, what was the cause of the fatality? And so really by analyzing the data from the IRS database, we produced these types of graphs. And for all of those different 38 questions, there are graphs like these that have been produced, which very clearly and simply give you an idea of why these fatalities are occurring and where they are occurring. So you take, for example, the top right. So that shows you the percentage in total of people and age related, those that were fatalities, serious injuries, and of the total incidents. So the blue line is the total incidents, and you can see that pretty much the serious injuries follows the blue line, so which is what you would expect if there was no influence of that factor. But when you look at the fatalities, you start to see that in the 61 to 80 range, it sits significantly above the baseline normal where it should be, and the same with the 80 plus. So that indicates very clearly that as you get older, or people are more likely to be involved in a fatality if they are older. And then looking at the bottom left, again, looking at the location of the fire origin. So most of the fires happen in the kitchen, and that's 70%. But if you look at the number of fatalities actually in the kitchen, there's not that many as you might expect for so many fires. Yet when you look at the living room and the bedroom, there are significantly less fires there. It's normalized much lower, but if you look at the fatalities and the serious injuries, that's where most of them are occurring. Again, looking to the bottom right figure, you can see there that actually what is the source of the ignition, what caused that fire? And again, you can see they're very clearly smoking related, whilst the normalized blue curve is much lower. There is a spike both for fatalities and for serious injuries that are smoking related, but also you see there for heating equipment as well. So by producing these graphs, we were able to very clearly and easily see trends and kind of vulnerable groups. So here we have just a summary really of what the findings from that work were. In summary, fatalities were more likely to occur with vulnerable people, and these are the type of people that are age 60 above, as I've indicated, or if they're falling asleep or are asleep, or if they have an underlying medical condition, and also if they smoke. Excessive and dangerous storage was also a contributory factor, as was having some sort of physical mobility. Living alone was also led to a lot of fatalities, and also if the individual was suspected to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol, that also was a factor. So this became very clear when viewing this data that smoke detection alone is not very effective to protect vulnerable people, especially if they're not responding or able to respond promptly. And the group agreed that there were more interactive solutions that need to be proposed for these types of vulnerable people. And so there was a brainstorming session during which 14 recommendations were put forward as to ways in which fatalities could be reduced and serious injuries. And these are some of them. So warnings from smoke alarms to smartphones. So this isn't necessarily the occupant of the building that would have the smartphone, but somebody located nearby, perhaps a neighbor or a sentinel, someone that's been put forward to look to keep an eye on them. Increasing the sensitivity of smoke alarms at night would also give earlier warning. Linking domestic premises, high-risk individuals, to an alarm receiving center. So that's where the signal from your home would go directly to an alarm receiving center, and they would notify the fire and rescue service. Extending the LPS 1655 water mist system for personal protection, so having that used more broadly in different areas would help. And the use of video analytics was also explored as well as a way of not only providing fire detection, but also as providing a means of providing enhanced security, and could also be used as providing live information to fire and rescue services as well. And also it suggested that research work needs to be done into electrical fires and whether it's possible to see whether there are signatures that happen within electrical appliances prior to a fire taking hold, because that would obviously be a much more earlier warning. So phase one was completed in December 2019. And the briefing paper, which is shown on the right, describes in a lot more detail what I've been talking about just now. A lot more of the solutions are in there. And that's available from the link that's shown at the bottom. So the next stage really was to use that data to review the 126 fire investigation reports of the fatalities, to really try and hone in on what were the conditions, what exactly was happening, and why did that person die. And it was intended to perform this work really to identify whether there were further practical measures that may be put forward, further recommendations, and also as an opportunity, we have put forward during phase one 14 recommendations. Well, how effective would they have been in those 126 fatal fires? So that led to phase two. So phase two, I spoke at the start about how there were a number of questions that were posed. All the remaining questions from that initial brainstorming session, the remaining questions were addressed during phase two. So there were 25 of those, and those were looking at in more detail, were smoking alarms present? What was the condition of them? Were any accelerants present? What was the influence? Was the person under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or medication? This was backed up with toxicology data and reports. So we were able to hone in really on that. And did the person live alone? Did the smoke alarms operate during the fire? Were doors shut and prevented them from operating? Those kinds of things. And how many fatalities occurred inside the room and outside the room of fire origin? And could the fatalities or injuries have been avoided if a smoke heat alarm had been present, that earlier warning, and even with interconnection, providing warning throughout the flat or the house? Would that have potentially avoided a fatality or an injury? And as I said before, the 14 recommendations that were posed from phase 1, they were also reviewed as part of this secondary phase. And during the kind of transition between phase 1 and phase 2, there are a number of the questions which were coming forward from the group. Things like, what was the exact attendance time from ignition? So this would be different to what's reported in the IRS, which would be very roughly a rough estimation of when the fire and rescue service is attended. But actually now, when a fire investigation is done, there's a lot more detail as to exactly when the call was made and exactly when the first appliances arrived and those kinds of things. So it's really looking into more detail at that. And also, what was the level of disability of the victim? Because whilst the IRS may report that in very basic terms, in a bit more detail, what was that disability? And also an interesting question is, was there evidence that individuals were actually trying to fight the fire and that was causing the fatality, or were people just trying to leave? So again, lots of really interesting questions coming out of the end of phase 1 and before we started phase 2. So phase 2 was performed in a kind of a quantitative analysis and a qualitative analysis. So the qualitative analysis was looking at each report and going through it with a fine-tooth comb to really look at what happened in this particular scenario and how could that, what could have been in place that would have assisted or maybe provided warning earlier. And then the quantitative analysis was looking at across all of those reports, what was common to all of those reports and what interventions could potentially be, could have helped then. And so with the qualitative analysis, there were a number of different recommendations that came up for a broad number of different types of groups, for example, public services, public, and for fire and rescue services, as well as others. So for example, for public services, for the NHS to inform Scottish Fire and Rescue Services if when the NHS have visited a property, if they've seen an at-risk person, to then inform the SFRS to perform a safety check. For the public as well, there's recommendations in there for the public. For example, investigate when neighbors' smoke alarms go off, especially if they go off at night and they don't normally go off. And if you go to somebody's house, a neighbor or a relative, and you see that there are signs of near misses, like scorch marks from cigarettes, and they haven't had a fire safety visit, then again, to inform the fire and rescue service so that they can come out and have a chat with the vulnerable person and try and ensure that there is some interventions in place to assist them. And for public services, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service fire investigators, there are a number of recommendations put forward on what they could do as well to improve how they collated their data and ways in which they could work in the future. And there's loads of these in the briefing paper resulting from this work. These are just a small selection. So during the quantitative analysis of the data, so this was looking across all of the reports, what were we finding that were common? So one of the first findings, which was quite surprising, was that 11% of the fatalities were not fire fatalities. So that's an interesting finding. How is that possible? And this is typically the condition or the scenario where somebody is dead and there's a fire. And the fire and rescue service turn up and they see there's a fire that's out of control. They get that under control. They see a person is dead. And at that stage, they don't know when that person died. And so they put that down as a fire fatality. So in the IRS, that's recorded that person passed away as a result of fire. During the fire investigation, a lot more data is gathered and a lot more evidence is generated by performing toxicology investigations and producing reports. And if, for example, you do that and you see that actually there's no toxic chemicals within their blood circulation, there's no soot around their nose, and there's no signs really of the fact that they were alive before, then you can rule out the fact that actually they were not alive when the fire started, and it's more likely that they had a heart attack, collapsed, and were dying, and they had something cooking, and that subsequently caught fire, and that's what caught the attention of the fire and rescue service. And so you get this case where, in effect, about 11% of fatalities that were being recorded as fire fatalities were not actually fire fatalities. So there needs to be a way really of going back to the loop and closing that loop to update that data from IRS. So in terms of the items first ignited, you can see there that bedding, chair and sofa and the clothes on the victim are really high up on the list there. On the right-hand side, again, you can see mobility issues really showing up there, that 27% of those fatalities, people had mobility issues, and across Scotland, I think the percentage is 12% for the number of people that have mobility issues. So you can see again, if there is a mobility issue, you are more likely to be involved in a fatality. And looking at the recommendations, I've just again focused on some of the more salient ones here. Things like providing warning from alarms to mobile phones to smartphones, linking up domestic premises to an alarm receiving center, having a water mist system present, using video analytics to provide earlier warning. All of these things were really high on the list that could have had a significant impact on those fatalities. And there are further recommendations that are available in the report. And in terms of the quantitative analysis, looking at, again, just a selection here, this is not everything, looking at the cause of death. So yes, 65% were attributed to toxic gases and that causing their death. Some were due to burns, as is shown there, and some were toxic gases and burns, and some were not so sure even at the end of it. And so those have been reported as a death in a fire. But yeah, that's quite surprising to see such a high number really of toxic gases, which is the cause of death. So the graph on the right is carboxyl hemoglobin levels. So this is when there's a fire taking place and carbon monoxide is burning, and you're breathing it in and it's in your bloodstream, and effectively you lose control of yourself and collapse. And this just shows for those cases how that carboxyl hemoglobin levels increased. Bottom left is the blood alcohol levels, how they increase for those people. So I think above 200 is really quite dangerous. So quite a lot of cases with high alcohol content. So in terms of the collating so far, there was lots of recommendations that were proposed, and there were so many actually that you needed some way to order them to be able to say how they could be used. So it's broken down in 4 stages: preparatory, detection, warning, and intervention. So there are some preparatory things that can be done proactively before the fire takes place, discouraging risky habits such as smoking in bed, having heat alarms that are interlinked, having strategy in place, making sure that the victim is aware of that the occupant is aware of that before there's a fire. For public services to really report near misses more to SFRS when they note them, keeping doors shut, etc., etc. So there's a whole load of those, as you can see there. In terms of detection, by having increased sensitivity of smoke alarms at night, they'll provide earlier warning. Having more alarms present is again more likely to provide earlier warning. Then once warning is provided, that can be given to somebody to intervene. The alarm receiving center can provide warning to the fire and rescue service, and interlinked alarms will create more noise, more likely to warn the occupant and neighbors. And then in terms of interventions, the sentinel or neighbor can get involved and help where safe to do so. The water mist systems could operate and start to suppress the fire, or the SFRS could be called out directly. So in terms of this bit here, we looked at collating the findings from this work and what can we do in the future. And so this concept risk score has been proposed, where a number of the factors that have been identified during this work are put forward and then given gradations of when they are more serious and when they are less serious. And then you could be given a score for each one of those. For example, here, and this has been normalized, so you get a mark out of 100. And then from that, you could have this classification through which you could propose solutions that are reflective of the kind of risk that that vulnerable person has. So they're just listed there. So in terms of the next steps, the briefing paper was published in December 2020 and is there on the right, and is available again from the website shown at the bottom. Now we're just promoting the work to raise awareness of the findings. So please promote this work with your colleagues and connections as well. And please do provide links to the briefing papers that are available for free from our website. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors of this research work, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the Fire Industry Association, the Scottish Government, and the BRE Trust. I'd like to thank Firebuyer for giving me this opportunity today to speak, and I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.